The strongest fence on the ridge was held together by a coil of rope and a handful of sticks, not a single nail. Jed Calloway had ridden this Wyoming spread for 15 years, and he'd never seen a fix that didn't use iron or wire. When the worst storm in a decade came down off the Absaroka front, every fence on the line was about to fail but one. White woman who'd arrived on a supply wagon 3 weeks before had bound those rails with knots so old they predated every ranch in the county. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan held the line when the West couldn't, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The morning the fence failed, Jed rode the south line before the sun had cleared the Absaroka rim. He found 3 sections of split rail flat in the mud. Where the nails went in, the posts had rotted and the nails had given way a little at a time until the whole weight of the rail tore free. Jed didn't curse. He sat his horse and counted the gap in his head, the cattle he couldn't afford to lose, the weeks of work it would take to haul green timber and set new posts. The land had been hard on him all year. A thin herd, a foreman who'd quit in March over a wage he said wasn't worth the cold, and a territory where the fences were failing faster than a man could mend them. The ranch sat on a bench above the creek, and the south line was the one that mattered because it faced the open range and the wind that came down off the mountains. Jed had built it himself the year he took the spread, splitting the rails by hand out of the lodgepole on the north slope, and for 10 seasons it had held. Wood rots in this country faster than a man expects. The wet springs ate the posts from the inside until there was nothing left under the bark but pulp. He'd been meaning to walk the line and replace the worst of them since the snow came off, and he hadn't done it, and now the fence was telling him what his putting it off had cost. Down in the valley, the wire fences were going up everywhere. The new barbed wire that Joseph Glidden had patented a few years back, the cheap coils that were supposed to settle the range and end the trouble. Jed had ordered a roll of it the previous summer, and the order had never come through, same as half the freight that was supposed to reach this corner of Wyoming. The wire was the future, everyone said so, and the cutting wars down in Texas and across Colorado had already shown how badly people wanted it. Fence against fence and blood over the line. But the future hadn't arrived on his ridge. The past was rotting in the mud in front of him, and he was stuck with the space between the two. He swung down and walked the break, reading the wood the way a man reads a wound. The nails hadn't snapped. They pulled clean out, the wet grain opening around them until there was nothing left to grip. The holes widened smooth and dark where the iron had worked loose in the wind. That was the thing about ironing green wood. It held for a season, and then it didn't, and there was no warning, just a fence flat on the ground. One morning with the cattle already nosing toward the gap. He picked up one of the pulled nails, turned it in his fingers, and dropped it back in the mud, because there was nothing to be done with a nail that had nothing to bite. The sky to the west had been building for 2 days, a slow bruise climbing the mountains, and every hand on the place knew what a third night of pressure meant. A storm was coming, the kind that tested everything a man had built, and the south line was the only thing between his herd and the open range. Jed stood in the mud and looked at the broken fence and the building sky. He had 2 nights and no fix. The weight of it settled across his shoulders the way a wet slicker settles, heavy and cold, and not going anywhere. He rode back toward the house with the count still running in his head, and he passed the garden and the woman working in it, the one the hands called the quiet one, and he didn't slow down. For 3 weeks he'd ridden past her every day, and she'd never been anything to him but a helper hired to keep the house and tend the vegetables. That was about to change, though he didn't know it yet. The change would start at the fence line before the night was over. She had arrived on a supply butt-board 3 weeks before, the kind of wagon that hauled freight and not passengers, riding up front with the driver because there was no other seat. The hands called her the quiet one because she never spoke above the sound of the wind, and they called her the helper because nobody had a better word for what she was. Jed had hired her through a letter forwarded from the settlement, a name and a few lines about house and garden work, and he'd barely looked at the letter twice before he sent back his agreement. He needed hands more than he needed details, and the wage she'd asked for was low enough that he didn't ask why. She was small-framed, and she carried herself with a stillness the men read as weakness, the kind of stillness that made them assume she had nothing in her worth fearing. Her hair was jet black and pulled back tight, and her face was all sharp lines, high cheekbones and a narrow jaw and eyes so dark they looked black in the shade of the porch. She wore a plain cotton dress, and a trail coat dusted the color of the road, and she moved through the work of the house like someone who had done harder work than this for a long time before she came to a place where the work was easy. The hands watched her carry the water buckets and split the kindling and said she was slight. Then they watched her set the kitchen to rights in a single afternoon and said nothing at all. Nobody asked her where she'd learned anything, and she didn't offer. There was one detail that should have told them more than it did. A coil of rope she kept in her quarters, natural fiber the color of dry wheat, finer and sturdier than the hemp the ranch used for hay. The hands saw her use it once on the garden trellis, binding the bean poles where they crossed, and the knots were too precise and too quick for a housekeeper. A man who knew what to look for would have recognized the rope for what it was. Hasanawa, the natural fiber cord of a country an ocean away. But no one on the ranch knew what to look for, and so the coil hung on a peg in her room and meant nothing to anyone but her. Jed passed her in the garden that morning and saw only the vegetables and the quiet woman among them, and he rode on toward the house with the fence and the storm sitting heavy in his mind. He hadn't yet looked at her as anything but a hand he'd hired through the mail. The hands had already decided what she was, and they were wrong about it. The wrongness of it was about to cost them a night's sleep and then save them a herd, and nobody on the place saw it coming except maybe the woman herself. By evening the wind had picked up early, wrong for the season and wrong for the time of day, a long steady push out of the southwest that bent the grass flat and set the horses pulling at their ropes. Jed had two hands propping the broken sections with cut poles and baling wire, a temporary fix to hold the cattle until he could ride to the settlement for supplies. He was standing at the south line, watching them work, when a long gust came through and took the fourth section down right in front of him. The prop scattered, and the baling wire snapped with a sound like a whip. The hands stood there looking at the new gap, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say that the broken fence wasn't already saying. The nails he'd had left were the wrong nails for wet wood, too thin and too smooth, and he'd used the last of the heavy spikes the week before on the north line. Where a steer had rubbed a post loose, he had no wire that would hold. He had no time to ride 3 days to the settlement and back. The storm he'd been watching build for 2 days was now 12 hours closer than he'd figured, and the cattle were already moving toward the gap, drawn by the smell of fresh grass on the other side of the fence. Every minute the opening sat open was a minute closer to losing animals he couldn't replace. That was when she appeared at the fence line, the quiet woman standing a few yards off with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the broken rails. She watched the failed nails and the scattered props the way a person watches, a problem they already know the answer to, her head still and her gaze moving once across the break and then settling. Then she crossed the distance to where Jed stood and told him she could fix it without nails. Jed looked at her for the first time that day, really looked. And what he felt was not unkindness, but certainty. The certainty of a man who has ridden this land for 15 years and knows what rope will and won't do. Rope wouldn't hold cattle against wind, he told her. Not these cattle and not this wind, and he said it the way he said most things, flat and final and without malice. He told her to go back to the house and tend the supper, and he turned back to the gap. She didn't argue, just nodded once, a small dip of her chin, and turned and walked away across the yard, and he thought that was the end of it. But she didn't go to the house. She went to her quarters and she came back out with the coil of natural fiber rope over her shoulder and a lantern in her hand, and she walked down toward the fence line as the last light went out of the sky. Jed watched her go and told himself she'd quit by midnight. He told himself that, and then he couldn't sleep for the thinking of it, and somewhere around the second hour he pulled on his slicker and followed the lamplight down to the south line. He found her already at work by the time he got there, kneeling in the mud at the first broken joint, with the lantern set on a flat stone beside her, the amber flame throwing her shadow long across the wet rails. A pile of straight sticks cut to length lay sorted beside her, and the coil of rope sat where her hand could find it without looking, and she was binding a fresh stick across the broken joint where the rail had split. There were no nails on the ground, no wire, no tools, but her hands and the rope and the sticks she'd cut from the willow scrub along the creek. She had brought nothing a rancher would have called a tool. She was building a fence with it. Jed stood back in the dark and watched, and he could tell she knew he was there, because her hands didn't change pace, but her shoulders set a quarter-inch straighter. She didn't look up. She took the rope and wrapped it around both poles where they crossed. 3 turns, 4, the rope laying flat against the wood with no twist in it, and then she drove a set of tight turns down between the poles to pull the wraps snug. He could hear the rope creak as she cinched it, a sound like a saddle strap taking weight. When she tied it off, the joint didn't move. He put his hand on it later, after she'd moved to the next one, and he leaned his weight into it and couldn't shift it, and the stick held the broken rail as if it had grown there. And the wind died for a breath in that hour, the kind of lull that comes before the real weather, and in the quiet he could hear her breathing steady and the rope singing under her pull. She worked the way a person works who has done the same motion 10,000 times, no wasted movement, no false start, her fingers finding the next rep before her eyes had to guide them. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected her to quit, and instead she was building something out of sticks and vine in the dark that his iron couldn't have built in the daylight. The building of it was so quiet and so sure that he stopped thinking about whether it would hold, and started watching how she did it. She worked that way because the rope does what the rope does when it's set right, and he could see that now even without the names for it. The wrap spread the load across the grain of both poles instead of bearing it on one point. The tight turns she drove between them pulled the wraps down so they couldn't slack, and the rope gripped itself the way natural fiber does when it's pulled taut against its own lays. It was not magic, and it was not guesswork. It was a thing done so many times, the hands knew it without the head, and watching her do it was the first time in a long while that Jed felt the ground shift under something he'd been certain of. He stayed at the edge of the lantern light and watched her tie 3 more joints, and each one was the same, the wrap spread across both poles and the frapping turns driven between them and the knot set fast. She never explained what she was doing, and he never asked, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people doing a job that didn't need words. By the time the sky started to gray at the eastern rim, she had lashed half the broken line. The joint stood straight in the mud where the nailed sections had fallen, and the fence was taking a shape his nails had never given it. What it couldn't yet do was hold weight, and the weight that was coming would test every knot she'd tied before the night was half over. The hands came down to the south line at first light, expecting to find the gap still open, and instead they found 6 joints lashed tight with rope, and the quiet woman still on her knees at the 7th. For a minute nobody said anything, and Jed watched the surprise move across their faces as they took in the line of bound joints standing straight where the break had been. Then the foreman's boy let out a laugh, short and incredulous, and the others took it up, the uncertain laughter of men who don't understand what they're seeing and would rather mock it than admit it. "Rope and sticks," the boy said, like a child's fort, like something from a country none of them could place, and the word country came out with a curl to it that Jed didn't like, but didn't correct yet. Jed stepped in then, but not to defend her and not to explain, because he couldn't have explained it if he'd tried. He told the boy to hold his tongue so she could work, and the boy's mouth closed. and the others went quiet too, shuffling their boots in the mud. It was a small thing, a foreman telling a hand to be still. But it was the first time Jed had put himself between her and the doubt on the place, and she heard it for what it was without turning her head, her hands never slowing on the rope. Now in the full light he could see the lashing plain for the first time, and it was not what he'd imagined in the dark. She was using a binding he'd never seen, a square lashing that didn't start with the clove hitch he half remembered from some boyhood camp, a faster way that wrapped the poles and then drove the frapping turns hard between them to lock the wraps down. Each joint was set at right angles and load-bearing, the kind of joint that could hold a framework or a raft or a fence, and the rope was sunk into the grain of the wood with the tension of it, gripping itself tighter the harder it pulled. He'd built fences for 15 years, with iron and wire. He was looking at a joint he couldn't have made and couldn't have taught, and it was holding weight he would have sworn rope couldn't hold. One of the older hands crouched beside a finished joint and turned it over in his hands the way you'd turn over a lock you couldn't pick, and he asked her what it was called. She gave him one word, low and even, a word from the language she'd carried across the ocean, and the man didn't repeat it. He stood up and walked back to the others and didn't laugh again, and the boy who'd started the laughing kept his eyes on the ground for the rest of the morning. Ed noticed that the older hand came back after dinner and watched her tie 2 more joints without saying anything at all. The barometer was dropping fast by midday, the cattle crowding the south fence and milling the way they do when they can smell the weather coming, and the herd was restless against the very line she was still repairing. While they stood there mocking her, the stakes had climbed, and now the fence she was tying was the only fence between 200 head and the open range, and the storm was hours away instead of days. She didn't change her pace. She just tied the next joint and the line grew tighter behind her, and the sky to the southwest turned the color of a bruise. The wind began to come in, long, steady pushes that bent the willow scrub along the creek flat to the ground. Her fence was about to be the only thing standing between Jed's whole herd and the open range, and the storm that would prove it right or tear it apart was closer than any of them had reckoned. The first gust came in wrong that afternoon, early and hard, a dry push ahead of the rain that flattened the grass and set the horses pulling at their ropes. Then a neighbor came riding in soaked to the skin, a man from the next spread east who'd put up the new wire the year before, the kind of fence everyone said was going to settle the range for good. He pulled up at the barn and swung down and stood there dripping, and the first thing he said was that his wire was gone. He said it flat, the way a man says a thing when he hasn't finished reckoning with it yet. And Jed stood in the barn door and waited for the rest. The barbed fence on the lower 40 had torn loose in the first real gusts, the neighbor said, the wire snapping where it had rusted at the staples, and the posts pulling clean out of the soft ground where the spring rain had loosened the earth. He'd lost a section of herd already, and he was riding the line, looking for them, and the look on his face was the look of a man who'd bet on the future and watched it fail in an afternoon. He asked Jed if his line had held, and Jed said he wasn't sure yet. The neighbor rode on toward the creek with his head down, and Jed stood in the barn door and watched him go. Then he turned and looked back up the slope at the lashed line, where the quiet woman was still working in the rising wind, and something shifted in him. The wire was the thing he'd been waiting on, the future that was supposed to save him the labor of mending rotted posts, and the wire had failed in the first gusts on the next, spread over. The rope was the thing he told her would never hold, and the rope was still standing. He didn't say any of this. He walked up the slope to where she worked, and he picked up a stick from her pile and held it out to her without a word. She took it and set it into the next joint and didn't look up, and that was the whole of the conversation between them. She had heard the same news. The neighbor's voice had carried across the yard, and she couldn't have missed the word wire or the word gong, and she didn't change a single knot. The next joint she tied the same way she'd tied the first one, the wraps and the frapping turns, and the knot set fast, and it occurred to Jed then that she had never been betting on whether her way was better than the wire. She'd just been doing the work she knew how to do, work that was going to be tested in a way she'd already accepted, in a way that wasn't going to change how she tied a single knot. In the wind, he watched her set the last joint on the south line, and for the first time he understood something about where she'd come from. The rope she used was the rope her grandmother had used in a town by the sea in a country he'd never seen. The binding was a discipline handed down hand to hand through generations of people who'd used it to hold prisoners, and to hold structures, and to hold anything that needed holding. It had a name he would learn later, a name for the rope art that grew out of an older martial practice, the way a son's trade grows out of a father's. She never said it aloud on his ranch. He didn't need the name. He watched her hands, and he understood the lineage of them, and the lineage was older than any fence in the county. And the wind came up, and the sky went dark, and the storm was on them, before he'd finished the thought. The full storm comes down after dark, and it's worse than the decade's reputation promised. Rain goes sideways, and the creek starts to climb, and the herd panics and presses the south fence with 600 pounds of beef to the animal, and the fence is the only thing between them and the open country. Jed is at the south line with a lantern when the first real wave hits, and the wind takes the flame sideways in the glass, and the amber light swings across the lashed joints and the mud and the dark shapes of the cattle crowding the rails. Cold rain stings, and the dark is total beyond the lantern's reach. The only sound is the storm and the cattle and the creak of rope under load. She's already there. She came down when the sky broke, and she didn't ask. And now she's moving along the line, checking the joints the way a person checks the stays on a ship in a gale, her hand on each lashing, her weight against it. Jed stops telling her what won't work somewhere in the first hour, and she stops waiting for his word. And they work the line together in the wind, two people holding the same fence in the same storm. They are no longer rancher and helper, just two pairs of hands against the dark. The cattle press the fence in rolling waves, and each wave tests the line. The line bends and holds and bends and holds, and the rope groans in the gusts but doesn't give. A joint near the middle begins to slip under the cattle's pressure. The wraps shift a quarter inch as the herd leans into it, and she wades into the mud past the rail without hesitation. She finds the frapping turns by feel in the dark, and she re-cinches them, the rope cutting into her hands as she pulls. And Jed holds the lantern high so the light falls where her fingers work. The rope grips itself as she tightens it, the natural fiber biting into the wraps it has already laid, and the joint locks back down where it belongs and holds. She pulls her hands back and wraps the worst of the cuts with a strip torn from her sleeve, and she moves to the next joint without stopping, and Jed watches the rope take her blood and hold the fence anyway. It smells of wet wool and turned earth, and the iron tang of the lantern, and the sound as the rain on the slicker, and the cattle lowing and the rope singing under load, and the cold drives straight through the soaked cloth into the bone. She works with her hands raw and bleeding where the rope has cut them. He doesn't stop. Jed watches her and understands for the first time what it means to have a skill so deep it carries you past the point where the body wants to quit. The rope is doing what iron couldn't have done, not because rope is stronger than a nail, but because the hands tying it have been trained past the moment when a normal person would let go. The difference between a fence that holds and a fence that falls is the discipline in those hands. They move down the line together, re-cinching where the storm loosens, and the fence holds behind them as they go. Cattle press and don't break through. Across the property, the nailed sections that the hands patched are groaning in the wind, and Jed can hear the wood complaining in the gusts, the long, slow protest of nails working loose in wet grain. Somewhere in the second hour, two of those sections tear loose with a sound like a branch breaking, and the cattle go through the gap before anyone can reach it, and Jed hears it happen and knows there is nothing to be done for those sections tonight. The last line is the only thing standing now between the main herd and the open range, and it's holding and the woman beside him is the reason it's holding, and he doesn't say so because the moment doesn't need words and the work doesn't leave room for them. The eye of the storm passes sometime after midnight, a false calm that lasts the length of a held breath. Then the back wall hits harder than the front. Wind reverses and drives the herd forward into the south line, and the cattle hit the fence in a rolling wave that takes the whole weight of the herd against the rails at once. The weakest joint on the line is the first one she tied at dusk, the joint she'd set before she'd found the grain of the wood, and now it takes the full load. Jed sees it, and his stomach turns, because if the first joint goes, the line goes, and the herd goes, and the year goes with them. The rope strains, and the wraps creak, and the stick bows under the pressure, and for one long moment it looks like the joint is going to go. Jed is already moving toward it, though he doesn't know what he'd do if he got there, because there is no fix for a broken joint in the dark in the middle of a storm except the one she already used. But the fraps hold. The turn she drove between the poles gripped the wraps, and the wraps gripped the wood, and the whole binding tightens instead of slipping, the way the natural fiber does when it's loaded right and the joint doesn't give an inch. Under the surge, the stick straightens, and the rope bites deeper, and the cattle press against it and stop, and the line holds, and Jed stands in the mud with his hands empty and his heart pounding, and watches a joint he would have bet against hold the whole herd. Down the line, two of the nailed sections that the hands prop give way at once, the rail swinging free and the cattle pouring through the gap before anyone can reach it. But the lashed line holds, every joint she tied intact, the rope dark with rain and tight as sinew, and the cattle that press against it mill and turn and don't break through. The storm spins itself against that fence for the rest of the night. It doesn't move. The woman who built it stands in the mud at the end of the line with her hands wrapped in a strip of her own cloth and watches the sky start to lighten in the east. She's swaying a little with the exhaustion of it, the kind of tired that goes past the body and into the bone, and she's still on her feet because the discipline that tied the knots is the same discipline that holds her up. Dawn comes gray and slow, the storm moving off to the east in a long trailing wall of cloud, and the south fence line stands in the first flat light of morning, every lashed joint intact, the rope tight and dark, not a rail shifted. Jed walks the line in the early quiet and puts his hand on each joint as he passes, and every one is solid, and the cattle are still on the right side of the fence, and the herd is whole. Across the property, the nailed sections are down or loose, the props scattered, and the baling wire hanging in loops, and somewhere over the ridge the neighbor's wire is gone. Only one fence on the whole ridge held through the night, and it's the one that has no iron in it anywhere, and Jed walks the length of it in the gray light and doesn't speak because the fence has said everything there is to say. By mid-morning, the hands are at the south line, and none of them are laughing. They stand at the fence and look at the joints she tied, and the boy who started the mocking reaches out and turns one over in his hands the way the older hand had the day before, and he doesn't say a word. The foreman walks the line and counts the joints that held and the nailed sections that didn't, and the count tells the whole story without anyone having to speak it. 12 joints lashed and standing, and 4 sections nailed and flat. The older hen who came back to watch her tie joints the day before is already pulling the broken nailed sections apart, sorting the good rails from the rotted, getting ready to do it her way. Jed finds her at the garden edge, coiling her rope, her hands raw and bandaged with a strip torn from her own cloth. She's moving slow, the way you move when you've spent everything the body had and are running on what's left underneath, and her fingers are careful with the rope the way you're careful with something that belongs to someone else. He stands and watches her for a moment. Then he crosses to her, and he doesn't make a speech and doesn't thank her in the loud way a man thanks someone for show, and instead he asks her to teach him. It comes out plain the way most things come out of him, and the asking is the whole of it, because a man who has ridden this land for 15 years on the certainty that iron and wire were the answer doesn't ask unless something has broken open in him. She looks at him for the first time that day with something other than patience, and what passes between them is not love and not even trust, but a recognition. They were two people who'd both learned what it meant to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves, and had seen each other do it through a single night. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't need a name. It comes from doing the same hard thing on opposite sides of the same fence and finding out at dawn that the fence held. She nods once, the same small dip of the chin she'd given him at the fence line when he told her it would never hold, and this time the nod means the opposite of what it meant before, and Jed takes it and doesn't press for more. In the days that follow, the ranch repairs its lines, and the new joints going up along the south fence are lashed and not nailed. She's out there with the hands in the morning light, teaching the older one with the slow patience of long practice, her hands still healing under the bandages, the rope moving slow through her fingers so he can follow the path of it. The boy watches from the rail and doesn't laugh. After a while he comes down off the rail and asks to try, and she shows him where to set the first rap without a word of reproach, and lets him ruin the first two attempts before he gets the third one right. The rope she uses is the same coil from her quarters, the Asanawa she carried from a country an ocean away, the natural fiber cord her grandmother used in a town by the sea before any of this. The skill was never a trick she pulled out to surprise anyone, and it was never a performance for the men on the ridge. It was a thing carried across water and kept quiet through weeks of garden work and housework, held in reserve until the night the ridge needed it, and on the night the ridge needed it, the skill did what the iron and the wire could not. Jed watches her teach the hand, and he understands now that the rope held because the hands that tied it had been trained past doubt, and the discipline of those hands was older than any ranch in the territory. A week later, a neighbor rides through on his way to the settlement, the same man who lost his wire in the first gust, and he stops to ask Jed how his fence survived the storm when nothing else on the ridge did. Jed looks over at the lashed line and then back at the man, and what he says is that a woman on his place tied it with rope. He says it plainly, without performance and without hedging, and he gives her the credit in front of another man the way he gave her the stick in the wind, by handing it over and letting it speak. The neighbor looks at the fence and then at Jed and rides on without another question, and Jed stands at the fence and runs his hand along a joint, and the rope is tied under his palm and the wood is solid behind it. The territory is still hard, and the herd is still thin, and the wire is still coming, and nothing about the year has been solved by a single fence. But one fence on the ridge is lashed now where it used to be nailed, and the man who owns it asks before he assumes, and the woman who taught him coils her rope in the evening light and doesn't explain what she knows. Some things that cross an ocean stay quiet, and they stay quiet until the night they're needed, and on the night they're needed they hold. The lashed fence stands in the morning light, the rope dark and tight, and two figures walk the line together where one used to walk it alone. Maybe strength was never what you hammered in, but what you learned to bind. Drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels.